Hello, welcome. I see there's one person here. Oh, it looks like it's Uncle Rick. Hi, Uncle Rick. So, today, second person, hello. Today we're going to be working on this area of the wing here. So you'll notice that I did fill in a little bit more since last week. Just the other half of the tail here, and then this other patagial mark. If you have any more questions about that, feel free to let me know in the comments. But otherwise, we'll go ahead and get started on this underwing area. So these are the underwing coverts that we're going to be working on today. So I'm going to take my eraser and just erase these graphite lines so that we can just barely see a border there to help guide adding colored pencil. But we don't want the graphite to show through. And if you have your reference photo out, you'll see that there's a lot of patterning going on the underwing of this particular bird. Red tails have a lot of variation, like I've mentioned in some of our other classes. This one is pretty boldly marked though, so that will be fun to work on. So I'm going to start, like I typically do, with just a base layer, which is going to be sort of the lightest color there. And it's really just kind of like a dirty white shade on the underwing. So a good color to use for that would be something like this ivory, which is almost, white, but it's got a little bit of a yellowish sort of tinge compared to this white here. So I'm just going to sharpen that and put down a base layer. And just like with everything else, good to go in the direction of the feather barbs. So sort of like in this direction as you go. It's probably not going to show up on the paper very well, but hopefully you have something like this. And if you don't, a good alternative would be a very, very light gray, or a gray using very, very light pressure, hardly at all. So like a warm gray 1 or something like that. Because I know some colored pencil sets may not have this kind of ivory. But I'm just going to fill in this whole area. And you'll notice I had a little border here with these outer feathers. We'll do those last, so I'm just going to stick to these ones first because they're kind of different in coloration than the outer feathers. These are all the underwing coverts, so they're fairly small feathers in comparison to the really long flight feathers, which we will start working on after this. I hope everyone's having a good weekend. I am. I just saw a great horned owl a little while ago. That was really fun. They've been really active in this neighborhood. So yeah, as you get to here, try to stick to this kind of back and forth direction. And if you want to smooth out your base layer a bit, you can go over the top of it with a white pencil. I like the luminance pencils for that in particular. Some red tails you'll see their underwing really kind of just looks like this. I mean, we're going to add shadow, of course, but with very few markings. There's so much variation. Then others you'll see almost the whole underwing is filled in with a lot of modeling. But this one's, kind of in between, pretty heavily modeled. So looking at the colors here, I notice Definitely something like a burnt sienna would be good to have. So like this one here, most colored pencil sets should have that. And it's good to get it pretty sharp because we're going to be using it for pretty detailed markings. And then some kind of lighter colors. Like for example, burnt ochre, kind of an orangey brown, or terracotta, which is a little bit brighter than the burnt ochre. Certainly seems like I've been using these colors a lot, the burnt ochre especially, these classes. The barn owl from before had a lot of that as well. And let's see, I'd also want something like a little bit of a darker color, like burnt umber, to add in there also. And then there's one feather I'm noticing, you know, I think that's probably the alula, yeah. The alula, which is kind of this outer feather that looks almost like a thumb sticking off right here. That's different in color. It's got some gray barring, so we can also add that one in. So like a dark cold gray. So cold gray 6. Or if you're using Prismacolors, it would be something like a 90% cold gray, I think. But the alula is a really cool feather because birds use that. They have it go up a bit. It's kind of like, you know, the flaps on an airplane wing. So when they're landing, it helps to break their landing and make a smooth transition to landing. So we'll start by adding that one in. If you're looking at your photo, you'll see it's not very big. It's just this little feather here, and it bulges out very slightly. May have exaggerated that a bit much, but yeah. And then you've got these little bars here. And as always, if you think of any questions throughout, just let me know in the comments if you're watching this live. I say that because I think a good deal of people have been watching it later. I know Saturday night is kind of a funny time, but you know, it's a pandemic, so it's the time that kind of works the best for me right now. I'm then taking a cold gray 1, and just smoothing that out a bit. And you can go a little darker with the pressure. Those bars also. Let's see. So now we have a lot of small feathers here, and it's good to take a look if you have your photo out and see how many rows of feathers are obvious. And that can be often really hard to tell from a photo. This one, you can see it pretty clearly, which is nice, especially because you have a lot of modeling going on. But it can definitely get tricky if you're drawing something that has a completely white underwing. Sometimes the rows of feathers are very subtle. And when doing that, like, you know, recently I was drawing a swallow-tailed kite, and that was kind of an issue. It can be good to look at just, you know, very loosely reference other photos via Google image search and just see, like, how many rows of feathers you have under here. Because not every photo is going to show it. But at least in this area, this outer part of the wing here, we're just going to start out with that. It looks like we have some very small feathers in here. And then we have 3 main rows after that. So there's like a row across here, and then a row here, and then finally we'll do this part last, this outer row, which has more grayish barring on the underwing. So what you can do to help differentiate those rows before we start adding any patterning is take sort of a medium gray. I'm going to use, let's see, warm gray 4. And just outline sort of the shadows. And I shouldn't say outline because you're going to be doing this very lightly. But sketch out where those different feather groups are. So we've got kind of a row here. It's probably, a few rows because these feathers that are more out towards the leading edge of the wing are going to be really, really small. And then we have a bigger row here. Let's see, I'll do a little measuring. Yeah, they come out to about there. And then we have these pretty long feathers here. And once you get to this point, if you're really particular, you can count them. So most birds are going to have 10 primaries, which are these outer flight feathers here. So once you get to these larger underwing coverts, there also should be about 10 under here. And sometimes when you look at a photo, you're not going to see exactly that. Feathers might be overlapped, there could be feathers missing. There could be a bird with a weird number of feathers. Back when I used to do raptor banding, that was a thing that happened one time. I think it was a red tail that had like an unusual number of tail feathers. So that can happen sometimes. So hopefully you can sort of see how I outline those groups, sketched in those groups. Now I'm going to take So I'm going to start with the lightest sort of brown shade, this modeling here, using a burnt ochre. And I'm just going to start adding in the barring on these underwing coverts. Looking at my photo, trying to replicate that. So on these feathers, you'll notice that it might be kind of hard to see, but often there will be this bar that's towards the tip of the feather on each one. Here, I'll do my little zoom in with a sketch pad thing to show you. Just kind of what each of these is going to look like. Yeah, so they have often this dark area towards the tip of the feather. And then like a couple bars in here. Yeah, probably more than a couple, but you get the picture. They've got this dark area towards the end of the feather. And these are pretty loose, sort of somewhat fluffy feathers, but they're certainly not as loose as like some of the belly feathers are going to be. They're a little bit more organized, I should say, I guess. So then we can just do the same thing here. And also, pay attention to adding in this line down the middle of the feather, the shaft. And then you have the barbs coming off either side. Actually look at the paper while trying to look at it through the screen, which can sometimes throw me off. But you've got these coming off like that and like that. Let's try to stick to that direction. Of course, this is on a much smaller scale. And then some of these actually have less barring, and they kind of just have this little dot towards the end of the feather. So for a few of those, you can add just this little dot. It's more of a dot with a line kind of trailing it. And then some of these ones, they're not really very mottled at all. You might just have a few small markings there. Let me try to zoom this in a little bit. It's always a balance because I don't want to zoom it in so much that it gets blurry. I think that should be good. Then once you have the lightest areas in, you can add like burnt sienna and darken some of them a bit. Think of it this way. What we're doing now is just the markings, and we're gonna add what's kind of like a glaze over the top for the shadow area. So the shadow is gonna come last. Some of these markings are kind of pointy. Then when we get to this row here, we have quite a bit of barring going on. And again, I would use burnt ochre and then go over the top of it with something like burnt sienna. Just because, you know, it's a small thing, but I find it nice to use at least a couple of layers. It's just about anything. It just adds a little bit more depth to the drawing. And you'll see too that on some of these, the barring doesn't go all the way down to the base of the feather. It's just about half the feather. And you know, these little details with some birds, it might be different than this, but I'm just following what this bird looks like. And I tend to be the sort of person that tries to follow things pretty exactly a lot of the time, but you know, that's not necessarily all that important. Just depends on what you want to do as an artist. With some things it is, but you know, with the pattern on a red tail, it's not always as important. If you know red tails and you know exactly how they can vary. A little more shadow in between those feathers. And then burnt sienna. And this is the color that shows up a lot in nature. It's like a dark reddish brown. So that's just the basics there. And you know, oftentimes when you get this kind of barring, the bars will sort of line up. So they kind of do here. Definitely more so when we get to these outer flight feathers. And now finally, we can start adding in the shadow. So I like to think of it as with something like this. You do the markings first, and then the glaze over the top. Which, sorry, I already said that, but in case anyone's just joining. So for that, it's kind of a warm shadow, so I'm going to use Warm Gray 3 and see how that looks. And I'm using really light pressure to go over the top. Because if you use too much pressure, you can lose the color underneath. And if you find that you want your shadow to be a bit darker, you can just keep going over the top with more layers. And a good pencil that can help to smooth that out is Warm Gray 2. As you can see, I use this pencil a lot. It's a good one for smoothing colors out. I'm really not sure why, but I learned that tip from Bonnie Snowden's videos. She has really good tutorials. Certain pencils, it's something about like the pigment in them, something like that, that makes it so they're especially good for smoothing out layers. Alright. Then there's a few spots where I just want to make the middle shaft of the feather a little bit more pronounced. Okay, so now let's work on this area down here. So we're going to do the same thing. Look at about how many layers you see there. And honestly, there's really not that many. A lot of the smaller feathers we already took care of adding in this patagial mark. And they're pretty dark in here. So really, we just have basically 2 rows of feathers here. A row that ends around about here, and then a row here. Oh, I'm sorry, that we're focusing on right now. We'll do that outermost layer that has the more grayish barring last. So we're focusing on just 2 at the moment. And you'll notice also that the feathers, if you're looking at your photo, the feathers that are in towards the body are a little bit longer than the ones that are more like out here. And if you look closely at these feathers, you'll see that they're pretty pointed. So again, I'm just taking a medium gray pencil and getting these feathers penciled in a little bit. Just a rough outline, a sketchy kind of outline of the feathers. Again, making sure that you don't have like hard lines when you're doing it. Because these are kind of loose feathers. then we have this row. So now this is the part of the underwing that is right bordering the secondary feathers. Make sure that's not in shadow. There we go. I don't think it was, but the screen on Facebook Live is so funny. It has like a dark gradient at the bottom, so I'm not sure if that's what you're seeing or just the way the filming screen is. Anyway. Now we can take burnt ochre and start adding in the modeling. And it's a little more of like a burnt ochre wash in some areas. Got a little more yellow in there also as well, actually. So for that, we can add another color. Like this light yellow ochre in some spots. So that's like a brownish yellow, basically. But I'll start with this. Just using pretty light pressure, the burnt ochre. So by a wash, I mean some parts of the feather are more uniformly just light brownish. And then you have other parts that have more banding, more barring. So you can see as I'm adding this patterning in, as we get closer to this area, the feathers are getting a bit shorter. Actually, quite a bit shorter by the time we get to here. Try to make sure too that the barring is all filled in, that it's not too scribbly. Meaning you don't have like white spaces in the middle of your barring. Which I'll probably go back later and touch mine up a little bit just because I don't want to take too long on this. But then you can take your burnt sienna. I want to give you an overall idea without like taking quite as long as I would on a typical commission. You can certainly go back in later and touch things up as well. And then, oh yeah, I said I was going to put some light yellow ochre in. Just a little bit, like not too much pressure. Especially when you get to these feathers that are towards the body. Gonna add a little bit more pigment here. But again, on some of these feathers, you don't have barring that goes quite to the base of them. And then once we get to this row here, we have quite a bit less barring, and the barring's a little bit more subtle as well, except for a few of the feathers that are longer and more towards the body. Those have quite a bit of barring on them. So I'm going to make sure I don't have any graphite lines that are in the way here. But again, I'm sticking with the feathers that have the reddish brown barring. We'll work on the ones with the gray barring later. So let me make sure I have those sketched in. We have one here that's pretty long. And then another that's next to it that's got a fair bit of barring too. But the rest of them really don't. They do, however, have a pretty well-defined shaft down the middle that's reddish brown or burnt ochre. But when you look at these ones here, got quite a bit of markings there. And something else you'll notice, it's subtle here, but a lot of the time, or I should say most of the time, when you have this kind of patterning on a feather, there's sort of a V. And it varies as far as how pronounced that V is, but there's a bit of an angle to the barring sometimes, and I exaggerated it here. It's not that exaggerated on these feathers, but you can see it a little bit. So try to keep that instead of going, just straight across. And yeah, the more birds you draw, the more you'll notice little differences with the barring patterns, how wide the bars are. And it can be a good exercise too to try and look at, instead of looking at the dark areas, look at the space of the white areas between the bars, because that can give you a different perspective also. But for these, we really just have this middle part of the feather. And then at the end of the feather, you do have a light reddish brown wash with some really subtle bars there. And I do try to be careful with putting my hand on the paper like this. I did just wash my hands, so it's not really a big deal. But you don't want to get too many oils on here, but I want to make sure everyone can see. So it is good to get in the habit, usually when you're drawing, to have a piece of paper under your hand, just so that problem doesn't happen. All right. Put a little light yellow ochre in there too, to blend that wash area. And then with a nice sharp burnt sienna pencil, you can darken some of the modeling too. Barring, I should say, yeah. Especially these couple of feathers here, they're pretty dark. And it's good especially to have your pencil really sharp when you're doing this part down the middle of the feathers. So you may say, okay, I just sharpened my pencil. I'm going to go down the middle of all these while it's nice and sharp. And one thing I'll do sometimes, it's nice, I kind of do this subconsciously, but to keep your pencil sharper for longer, if you start turning it around from time to time, that will help it to stay sharper for a longer amount of time. But I find myself sharpening pencils super often. Just because I really like working with very smooth paper, and with smooth paper, like this smooth bristle paper, you really kind of have to keep your pencil sharp to get the details in. Yeah, and some of these, you see areas that you especially want to get dark, you can use the burnt umber. Or with Prismacolors, I think it would be a dark umber. But yeah, it's good not to go over these lines too much because you might start to make them too thick. I just decided I wanted to darken them. And you know, if you do accidentally make a line too thick, don't worry. You can just erase it and then go over it again. Which for something like that, an electric eraser would be ideal because it will erase it pretty cleanly. But you can also use something like just a normal eraser. You just might have to erase it pretty hard. Always be very careful if you're using, HB pencil erasers. I like to rather than a big eraser. It's just kind of personal preference. But you want to be really careful first that your eraser is clean. And also, if you're using it for the first time, that it's not one of those erasers that doesn't work. But, a typical, like a pencil that a student would have, this kind, they have pretty good erasers, I think. Because those ones that don't work, sometimes you'll try to use it and it will make this awful sort of smudge on there. So always test things out before you try it in your actual drawing. And now that we've got that in, we can start shading more. So it's good to remember, when you have a shadow in here, so we used warm gray 3 before, try to stick to that same thing and stick to about the same number of layers because you have a pretty uniform shadow here. And I did it that way, but you may find it easier for yourself to just get all of these markings in and then put the shadow in. And there's no harm in if you have a color that you want to remember and you put a drawing down for a little while and come back to it. You can set that color aside or write it down or something just so you remember. Because that can be an easy thing to forget, especially when you're using gray. So I'm just going lightly over the top of everything, but with a pretty sharp pencil and trying to follow the basic structure of these feathers, so like the direction of the barbs. We've got some more shadows going on here too, don't we? And we've got a little bit more barring on some of these feathers, so we can add that in too. And if I was doing this, typically I would spend maybe even a couple of hours or more on this whole area. And I am going to go back in later and spend more time on it, because I actually am selling this drawing, so I do want to make sure that it looks its best. But I also don't want to have you sit through 2 hours of me working on this underwing at this moment, so just showing the basics. But as always, feel free to ask questions. And you know, the only things when I go back in and work on this more, all I'm really going to do is work on smoothing out areas and maybe adding a few more layers and maybe boldening the colors a little. So it's nothing that's like not really gone over in this lesson. It's just touch-ups. So a little more burnt sienna here. Okay. That's pretty good. Oopsies. Too dark there. So then, you know, I'll touch up the outlines of these edges a little. And now we're going to work on this final row here before we get started on the flight feathers, which I think is a really fun part. But you know, with the flight feathers, we're just going to talk about some of them and just the overall strategy there. Because again, it would take much time for you to sit through me doing the entire wing. But if you're looking, before we get to that, one thing at a time. If you're looking at this, you'll see a row of feathers that have kind of rounded ends and gray barring. So I'm just getting rid of that graphite. And these feathers are a little bit less fluffy than the other underwing coverts. They've got a bit more of a defined outline. And to outline these, I'm just going to use a very light gray. You know, I think I'll use actually the cold gray too. Oof, it's getting down to its last bit here. So, oh, we'll erase this too. If you're looking at your photo, pay close attention to the shape of these feathers. So, the ones that are more out here, there's a couple that are pretty small and a little more pointy. Then as you get around here, a little bit longer and wider with rounder ends on them. And also pay attention to how they're overlapping each other too. So for most of them, you have this trailing edge that's sort of going over the leading edge of the next feather. It's trying to focus on my hand, isn't it? All right, let me try. All right, I think that should be good now. One here. So think wide, rounded kind of feathers. We're just going to get each one in, and then we will add the markings. And you got about 10 feathers here. So, I have this line marking where the primaries end and the secondaries begin. Now I have 10 feathers. Because off of each of these is going to come a long primary feather, okay? And for the base layer of these, I'm going to use a really light gray, cold gray one. So now we're switching over mostly, I'd say, not entirely, but to cold grays for this area, at least for the base. And use pretty light pressure. When we add some of the shadow glazes over, that is more of a warm tone though. It's really interesting. This bird, let's see, can tell that this bird is almost certainly not flying over snow. But if you've ever photographed raptors, when they fly over snow, it's really incredible. You can see details incredibly well and sharply because the snow reflects light back up and lights up the whole underside. So those are really good drawings to work from. And it's just really fun to photograph raptors when there's fresh snow for that reason. I'll smooth that out a little bit with white pencil too. Alright, so now we can use some darker shades for the modeling, and it gets pretty dark, so I'm actually going to use Cold Gray 6 again, which is the darkest cold gray. Or if you're using Prismacolors, it would be like a cold gray 90%. So these couple of feathers towards the leading edge of the wing are especially dark. And once you get to these feathers, and then when we finally get to these primaries and secondaries, pay really close attention to the shape, because it is important for these feathers, and most especially for the flight feathers. Because that's what's really going to show the overall shape of the bird. And it's good to start practicing, thinking about that with these feathers here. Of course, the reason these feathers have such more defined edges is because in order to be able to fly, the birds have to have really stiff flight feathers. Some more so than others. Like owls have fairly soft edges to their flight feathers, but it's still going to be much more of a defined edge than like the belly feathers or the underwing coverts, because they need that kind of structure in order to be able to have powered flight. So also you can look at about how many bars we have here. We might add a little warm gray in there too later, but especially with these ones because you've got sort of brownish tones. We'll just lightly start putting in the cold gray. Mixing cold grays and warm grays is a good idea too. Sometimes. Can add a lot of depth to a drawing. It's good to avoid, just sticking with one and not the other. But you gotta really observe closely to notice the differences because sometimes it can be a little subtle. So yeah, for the warm gray, we can use like a medium one. Let's see. Warm gray 4, maybe? Yeah. And just lightly add that in some areas, especially around this area where it's a little more brownish. You can even take a light brown, something like nougat, and add a little bit of that in spots where you see some brown. And you know why we're seeing brown? This is interesting. The feathers that have a little brown should be older feathers. And that's a really cool thing to pay attention to. Especially if you're a bird nerd like me, If you have a picture of a bird and you can see where some of these older feathers are, that can help you to figure out what age the bird is oftentimes. Because of the pattern of molt that's going on. So this is an adult bird, certainly, because the tail is red. I have to refresh my memory, honestly, on aging red tails, but yeah, I'd have to look at a pile guide. But you can tell by looking, I believe, I'll have to double check on this, but on these flight feathers here, by the width of the subterminal band. Try to remember to check up on that in a pile guide, which is a guide that banders use to age birds. So if I remember correctly, the older feathers if they have a really thin kind of subterminal band, I think that means they're juvenile feathers, which would mean that this is a second-year bird. And they look pretty thick, so I think this might be an after second year. A lot of species, you can only age them to either hatch year, second year, or after second year, just because of how molt works. It depends on the species, though. All right. If you want to really darken up some of these areas also, you can use Payne's gray or maybe even a little bit of black lightly in some of the areas here. Some birds are even aged, their molt is looked at using a black light. So owls, saw-whet owls, they do that. And the newer feathers are going to look different under a black light than the older feathers. So you get these amazing patterns showing up that can help to age the bird. All right, that's looking pretty good. Now we can move on to these feathers. So these are a little bit more loosely arranged. But they've got the same kind of shape. Rounded ends. Oh gosh. Fireworks again? Not supposed to be setting off fireworks in Massachusetts. I don't know if you could hear that. Alright. So for the base, I'm going to be doing coal gray 1. Again. Oh, geez, here we go. Probably not showing up over Facebook Live, maybe, but there are a lot of loud bangs of, I think, fireworks going on. So now, cold gray 6 again. You do have a little bit more brown going on in these feathers compared to these ones up here. So we'll just lightly use the cold gray 6 and then add some dark sepia also. And yeah, these are fairly V-shaped bars that you have going on, like I was mentioning before. I'm just going to zoom that out a bit because I see that it's trying to focus on my hand. Which I do not want. Yeah, so you've got this V shape and then it's a little bit more flat across the top. And you really just got like, once you get to this area, it's just a few bars. But yeah, make sure you don't go too dark, just to make sure we can add that brown in as well. I changed my mind, sorry. I'm gonna use walnut brown, which is not quite as dark as the dark sepia, but it's also a fairly neutral brown. So if you don't have that exact color, you know, any kind of dark, neutral kind of brown that's not like so dark it's almost black, because, you know, the dark sepia is considerably darker than the walnut brown. Not sure that difference is showing up here, but yeah. Okay, and finally we can, again, add some shadow over the top of that with the warm gray 3. Just very lightly. So over this entire last row. And you can smooth it out even more using something like an ivory or a white pencil. I wouldn't use the warm gray too for this particular part, just because it might start to muddy up some of these nice dark markings that you have going on here. All right. 901. We can do a little bit of these feathers too, just to give you an idea. I guess, you know what we'll do actually? I'm going to show you how to outline these, the individual feathers, and then next class we'll work on filling them in. So that way you'll get a sense of how to outline these, and you can do the same thing on the opposite wing, as well as working on the color of the underwing too. I'm sorry, my computer made a noise. So, just gonna erase this, but make sure you can still kind of see the graphite so that you have a guide of the edge of that wing. And we're just going to take a very light gray. I'm going to take a cold gray 2. You may want to use even a cold gray 1. It's the lightest one you have. I want to make sure people can see what I'm doing though, so. And you know, you can always go in later if you have more you want to erase here, but make sure you've erased enough that the graphite isn't going to show through. All right. And I would recommend for these particular feathers measuring the length of each one, because the length and the shape of these feathers is important. So let's make sure I have this on the proper scale. Okay. So this outer primary, P10, I measured how long that one is. It's going to be shorter than the ones that come out here. And red tails, yeah, they have 4 what's called emarginated primaries. And I'm going to do a little mini drawing to show you what that means, in case you don't know. Basically what it means is you're going to have this part that bulges out a bit more, and then when you get to here, it's going to be skinnier. So these are the 4 outermost primaries, but let me show you in my sketchbook also. And it's important for whatever species you're drawing to try and get this right, to be accurate. Because, you know, different species will have different numbers of emarginated primaries. I believe a lot of the buteos have 4. It's like most of them. I think broad-winged hawks have 3. So that's a little different. But there's this little dip here, and then it bulges out like that. And then you've got, you know, the rest of your feather that comes down like this. If you actually saw the end of it, it would look like that. And then, you know, this edge here, the leading edge, is very thin. So these feathers just help the bird to be able to soar really nicely, because it helps just aid the movement of air in the way it will aid flight. So the other thing you can pay attention to is, you know, what is the distance between feather tips? Yeah, the other thing, oh, I should have mentioned this. I didn't really show it on the drawing. You can't really see it in this picture, but the leading edge also has a part that comes out a little bit too. Like that, yeah. It's a bit more subtle. But that's not really, because of the angle and the way the feathers are overlapping, you can't really see it in this picture. And then you can also measure, the width of the feathers. Try and pay attention to where these ones are as a guide to help you too. And then remember, our primaries ended around about here, so we're trying to have 10 primaries. So take a look at the ends of those feathers and the shape of them. They're pretty pointed at the ends. And you've got this little part here. There's a little angle and then it kind of comes down like that. Okay. We've got 2 more that are emarginated. And it's good to do this lightly because you might want to make adjustments later. You can even measure, where is that dip. Get a sense of that. It's kind of like steps going like that. And if you're looking at a picture of a raptor and you can't tell the emarginated primaries, it's still a good thing to try and at least subtly show in your drawing. So it's something you can look up online information about, And another thing to come back and do from time to time is just look at, okay, am I matching the overall shape of that bird's wing? Because while it's good to look at details, you also want to look at the big picture. And I may notice, oh, I need to make some adjustments here. It's a little bit more of a difference between these feather lengths than what I showed. It's a little shorter. This might be a little longer. And yeah, so doing it lightly, there's no reason to go dark. I'm going a little darker than I might otherwise do just so people can see. It's still light enough though that I can erase easily if I want. So I did 4 emarginated primaries. This 5th one here is kind of like an almost emarginated, if that makes sense. There's almost a dip there, but not quite on number 5. And then you have this one. It's got like a little, in the photo, it's got a little part where there's like, the barbs are separated. I'm not going to put that in. I mean, you can if you want. Shows that feathers aren't perfect, but if you wanted to put it in, you just have a little V in there. Alrighty. So we're at 6. And then look at, where your very faint graphite line is and try to have the tip of your feathers be around it at that line. So you've got this part where it bulges out and then it starts to kind of come around like pretty round there. And for some, like this one, you might see that leading edge of the feather a little bit also. And these ones you certainly can too. Sometimes I have a tendency to draw feathers with this kind of flat edge and then I'll say, oh no, I want to have that leading edge, so you put just a little part in there too. So we got like 3 more before we get to the secondaries. And I'll go back in too and sort of double check some of those measurements a bit. But once you get to the secondaries, the shape of these feathers is going to change. They're not quite as pointed. They've got more of almost a squared off end. So let's see here. I'm just doing a little counting. We have 12 secondaries showing. I believe red tails have 14. So, you know, some of them, of course, aren't going to be showing because they're overlapping over the back. So birds usually are going to have a few more secondaries than they do primaries, especially the more longer winged birds. But now that we're getting around to here, these are going to be more squared off. And they're still overlapping such that the trailing edge is overlapping the leading edge of the next feather. And yeah, try to line them up with these feathers you've got here. Perfect. Okay. And I may look at that and say, oh, that doesn't look quite right, that shape. Which it doesn't. It's bulged out a bit too much here. So I can easily just take an eraser and shorten some of these feathers a little to give them more of a red tail shape. And that's something you may need to take some time tweaking because it's a tricky thing to get right, especially with raptors. So it may take some measurements of individual feathers and some patience. Yeah, see, these are a little longer than I made them. That's easy because you can just bring that out a bit more. And sometimes it's really a small difference, but then when you add in that subtle difference, the appearance of the bird looks really different. Just because that's how our brains take in information when it's like something like the outline of a wing. Like that's pretty important information for us to identify a raptor. Another thing I'll do sometimes just to keep track as I'm doing this is make a slightly darker line that borders in between the primaries and the secondaries as you're making these adjustments. Some of these, you know, they have this little point here and then it comes straight down. So try not to lose that. Alright, we're about getting there. And yeah, pay attention too to the angle here. There's a sharper angle on these primaries, and then as you come around to the secondaries, it's more almost horizontal. And then as you get down here, it'll even start to go up the other way. The angle is more up on the trailing edge of each feather. Alright, that's looking pretty good. I may have to make a few more adjustments. Go. And these ones, you know, the end of the tip of the feather is a little more pointed upwards, in keeping with that angle. And then oftentimes you can see shaft of the feather just here, and then it gets lost underneath the next feather. So you can just see it in some spots there. But I try to be really careful paying attention to this, especially because one thing really helped me to pay close attention to wing shape. A while ago, this must have been like 3 years ago or 4 years ago, I guess it was, yeah. I was working as a hawk hunter in Maine, and I did this t-shirt design for the back of the t-shirt, and my supervisor was telling me, you know, make these little adjustments, like these tiny, tiny adjustments to get the shape right on different species, like an osprey and turkey vulture and things like that. And as I was doing it, I realized, like, oh my gosh, the tiniest little adjustments can make a huge difference with how that bird looks. So it's just something to play around with. The moment, the angle of that might be a little funny. I want to make sure it's not. I think it was really just the tail. Had it at a slight angle. There we go. But yeah. So you can do the same thing with the other wing, which is going to be a little bit different because it's at a different angle. And also, this bulge shape is going to be maybe a little bit more exaggerated because the wing is swept forward. So pay close attention to that. Again, you're going to have the 4 emarginated primaries. But if you have any questions about that as you're working on it before next weekend, feel free to let me know. And the other thing you can do, of course, is fill in this whole area here. So yeah, next class, I may fill in some, depending on how much time I have, I may fill in some of this, but we'll make sure, you know, to talk about all these techniques. And then anything that you don't finish next weekend, you can finish later on your own time. So yeah, we'll talk about the primaries and the secondaries, and light and shadow and markings and everything like that. Maybe even molt a little bit too, because you can sort of see where some of the older feathers are. It's tricky because it's in shadow. All right. Thank you very much for coming to this class. I hope you liked it. If you have any questions, feel free to comment on the video or send me a message. And next week, I believe it will be our last class for this particular series, working on the flight feathers. All right, thank you very much. Have a good rest of your day. Bye.